really delighted to be here today to introduce Michael Piantedosi of the Native Plant Trust. I trust that most of you know the Native Plant Trust, formerly the New England Wildflower Society, which has long shared its knowledge about native plants and provided an opportunity for us to see them in their natural setting in garden and woods in Framingham. Before going to Native Plant Trust, Michael began his career in plant biology as a researcher in cyanobacteria and freshwater plant communities at the University of New Hampshire, where he received a degree in plant biology and environmental conservation. He then worked deep breath in regional herbaria, in soil analysis and biogeochemistry laboratories, as a horticulturist at the Museum of Science in Boston, and as a researcher in native plant horticulture at the Woodman Horticultural Experiment Farm. When Michael arrived at the New England Wildflower Society in 2014 as the director of their New England Plant Conservation Program, known as NEPCOP, and their seed bank of rare and endangered plant populations, I was really fortunate to get to spend time at his volunteer seed cleaning program, and I learned a great deal from him. Over those past 10 years since then, knowledge about the importance of native plants has become much more widespread. And since 2019, Michael has contributed even more to that effort as the Director of Conservation at Native Plant Trust. Michael will talk to us tonight about the seeds of change, about the use of native seeds and the role that native plants play in maintaining overall biodiversity in our landscapes. I'm really eager to have the chance to learn from him. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Beth, for that introduction. Thank you to you, Conservators, for having me tonight. I'll try to speak to the microphone. I have to light the microphone. Okay, I'll try to do that. Okay, well, thank you again, Beth. And I do look back on those days of cleaning seeds in the tiny classroom together very fondly. But that's it. I'm going to try to talk to you about a lot of broad initiatives that I'm doing with Native Plant Trust as Director of Conservation there. I've been with this organization for about 10 years now, and I've seen a lot of change with regard to how folks interact with native plants and native plant communities, and then all the way up, understanding about pollinators and habitat restoration, climate change, and the like. So my talk is about seeds, but I'm going to try to frame it in the understanding of all of ecological diversity and how seeds are such a crucial part of that for maintaining it. So I'm plugging a report I put out with Nature Conservancy in 2021 called Conserving Plant Diversity in New England. Just as a kind of framing for this to say, we try to think about plant diversity and therefore biodiversity on a regional scale. We used to be New England Wildflower Society, but as Native Plant Trust, we're just as focused on the New England region and the ecology in that region, specifically from the plant perspective. This report does go into looking at areas that have disproportionately high levels of plant diversity and where they are lacking in conservation, where they are more vulnerable to climate change, and trying to assess essentially where folks in the land trust and land preservation areas can strategize to protect land that has the greatest impact to overall biodiversity. So just to plug there and to say this is really about diversity and resilience of habitats. I'm going to go through this talk and talk a little bit about individual case studies, individual rare and endangered plants, as well as an initiative toward making common species more abundant, native species seed available to you, to me, and everybody in between us. But that's it. We try to look at this on a broad scale from the habitat level. So Plant Diversity Report that came out in 2021 was not only looking at where is biodiversity from the plant perspective across the New England region, but where is there likely to be resilience to shifting climates and climate change. Nature Conservancy had put together some really nice data and nice base maps for understanding where the vulnerable areas in this region are in terms of climate change. We use that as kind of a temporal aspect to, well, you should conserve it or preserve it sooner than later if it's more vulnerable to these shifting climates, in addition to maintaining higher levels of biodiversity. So we looked at a resilient network of representative habitats. We tried to look at maybe a way of crosswalking, so to speak, different habitat types across all the 6 states in New England. Because some states simply have more of one habitat than another state does, and yet they're disproportionately protected, disproportionately under conservation of different types. Climate change, I don't need to go into this too much, and I have a lot of slides, so I'm going to kind of quick with it, but it is altering ecological processes near and far, and I don't think you're a stranger to that. Likewise, New England is no stranger, and we are definitely experiencing a lot of those changes. I'm going to go into in a little bit a plant that I've worked really closely with for about 10 years, known as Jessup's milkvetch, a globally endangered plant that last year was underwater for several days when normally it would have been covered by ice and ice scour. And that's a major change from the habitat that plant is suited to. So this is something I see in real life in fieldwork quite a bit. We try to get toward goals that were in this report specific to global initiatives such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Global Plant Conservation program behind that. I'm just going to skip ahead to say if you want to visualize any of this, there is an interactive map online. You can find it at the nativeplanttrust.org website. Really, it's kind of neat to zoom into where you live, maybe, and look at the backyards around where your home is or where you spend a lot of time. But the layers that we bring into this, I think, do really emphasize the focus on plant diversity and biodiversity. Areas in this map that I'm showing that are maybe highlighted in black, those are areas of important plant areas, IPAs as we joke with them. But these are areas where disproportionately high numbers of rare and endangered plant species occur, and yet they either lack some kind of conservation protection, shown here in the blue, or they have a conservation that is for recreational use or even extraction, as opposed to conservation for natural processes and for ecology. Likewise, this is showing kind of the vulnerability of some of these habitats to shifting climates, usually as a result of kind of landscape homogeneity, where you don't have major variation in topography, where you're maybe too far away from a water body to feel that buffer of an impact. But this comes into it as, again, kind of that temporal aspect of what should we prioritize to protect first. And I'm starting this way because it's really top-down. I'm going to talk more about individual species and stuff like that. But this is our approach at getting into kind of land conservation. Native Plant Trust is not really a land trust, but we do want to think about strategizing how land is acquired and protected, because obviously that will impact the biodiversity in the future on those lands. So really what I want to talk to you about is seed, my passion through and through, and when I started with New England Wildflower Society and Native Plant Trust back in the day, I was really focused on the rare species seed bank. So some of you may be familiar with seed banks. I'm going to talk a little about some more famous ones, but ultimately I mentioned the Plant Diversity Report because that's the in situ habitat conservation piece of this. Ex situ conservation, in other words, seed banking or off-site conservation, is really nothing without having habitat to return seed and return plant species to. We don't really want to have a seed bank. Ideally, we would have these species on the landscape in abundance and in numbers enough to allow their populations to thrive. In lieu of that, we have a backup. We have an insurance plan for the endangered species of New England. This collection has just surpassed 2,000 accessions. It represents 320 different rare and endangered plant species from the 6 states of New England. And I'm going to show you in this talk, hopefully, how we use that seed bank to augment populations to allow them to thrive on their own after some human intervention. But I just wanted to outline some of the benefits of doing this work and doing ex situ conservation. Quite a bit different than land preservation, which is open to successional change. Everything in New England wanted to become a forest, essentially. It's protected from anthropogenic catastrophes and major changes in the landscape, including invasive species and climate change. It also differs from a botanic garden, ex situ conservation of seed banks, and collections and species in the dormancy being protected from pests, weather events, not undergoing artificial selection or drift by being in living collections, maybe in a small population. And you can store an awful lot of seeds in a really small space, and it's relatively inexpensive. And that's probably why we got really into it early on. But that said, this is all based at Garden in the Woods in Framingham, as well as the Zombie Farm Nursery in Western Mass, where we have both kind of cleaning and drying facilities, as well as freezers for the seeds. So the more famous seed banks that you may be aware of are the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is similar in some ways, but it's really there for crop relatives, for global food security and the like, or the Kew Millennium Seed Bank, which is at Kew Gardens, and ultimately that is focused on a lot of species preservation for rare taxa, as well as crop research and crop relatives and things like that. So we take a lot of our understanding of how to bank seeds from these groups and apply them toward native, usually rare species. This is the plaque on the outside of our seed drying room at Sami, and I read this quote in the mirror to myself every morning. I was in the bathroom amping myself up with it just before the start. Plants are vital to the future of humanity and all living things, and seeds are the genesis of it all. I do believe that, as hyperbolic as it sounds. And I just want to show you a little bit about what our facility looks like now, and just the fact that we're investing a lot in this. This is the seed processing facility at Asami Farm in Whately. Here's just a glimpse of what the seed drying and cold rooms look like. The freezers are essentially just scientific freezers that store seeds. And typically I'm a little more organized than these pictures make out, but this is essentially how we are heat sealing after manual cleaning, after wild collection of these seeds of endangered plants. And eventually they do get into the freezer, and if needed, we get them out back on the landscape. We do a lot of work with regard to germination research. We try to do testing of viability every 3 years, and getting through those 2,000 collections to do that. Just to make sure the seeds are viable, and if they're needed, they can be leveraged in that way. If they are not, then we are going to recollect them according to kind of strict protocols around non-collection. So backing up, that's starting with this plant diversity report stuff, and then I go into a little bit about the rare species seed bank, both of which have informed really the crux of my talk, which is the seed network I'll end on. But I wanted to say that in the conservation department of 5 people, 5 staff, we have a lot of different actions that we take on for rare plants, just to cover a couple of them here. We do try to protect land either with a couple of sanctuary properties that we maintain in the northern New England states, most of them being publicly accessible to anybody in this room, as well as trying to create reports and materials like the Conservative Plant Diversity and New Report, which hopefully will inform land conservation to some degree in the future. We do an awful lot of monitoring plant populations for health and threats. The New England Plant Conservation Program was started in 1990, and that is now 400, 500 active members in the 6 states of New England. All volunteer, all trained through our Plant Conservation Volunteers program to kind of get amateur botanists out into the field. And that is really crucial in concert with the state heritage programs, just to know what's where and what needs management, what needs seed augmentation, what are we monitoring to death that we should take an action on. And then this is the way to inform a lot of that, as well as just what we prioritize for seed banking and the like. A lot of tonight's talk is about banking and collecting seeds to preserve genetic variation of a species. And that's a major piece of just the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. With those seeds, with that knowledge and that data in hand on populations, we do habitat management for rare and common plants. A lot of the stuff that I learned initially was with rare and endangered plant taxa, and we moved into habitat scale restoration. A lot of common plants come into the picture. So we are also working on understanding where those priorities are, where those hotspots are as well. We do augment, introduce, or reintroduce plant populations within their historic range as needed. The seed bank, I've heard Kay Havens of Chicago Botanic Gardens say, we want seed banks, we don't want seed morgues. It doesn't make a lot of sense to bank the seed and then never do anything with it. Just to know you have that peace of mind is not enough. Whether that's leveraging informed research and understanding seed germination of the species, or understanding its genetic makeup, or using it to augment a population in the wild, that seed really should be there to support biodiversity, to support the species' long-term survival. That's what we try to do with it. When it comes to it, and when the time is right and precaution is taken, we will perform managed relocation. This is also known as assisted migration and is often fraught with controversy because we don't always know what should be moved where and when. And I think that's still true. It's true of every species that I work with. But that said, I think in the event where we're seeing extirpation or extinction, we should look for locations to introduce plants while still controlling everything we can about that introduction, knowing what variables are affecting it and if it's going to persist where we put it. A plug for the Plant Conservation Volunteers. This is a PCB field trip with Arthur Haynes, our senior research botanist, author of Flora Nova Angli, the man behind the curtain with Go Botany, if you ever use Go Botany. Arthur teaching some of the main PCBs, it's your wetland ID or something. Anybody in this room can become a plant conservation volunteer. And if you're not and haven't heard of it, please reach out to me and try to get involved. We train hundreds of folks every year from across the region in field data collection and seed collection and the like. It's a great way, I think, to build a conservation ethic because it's one thing to hear Latin names, it's one thing to read about them, or to see a picture on a website, but it's something totally different to visit, to interact, to be part of that place where that plant grows or that, where that ecology is taking place. A couple more photos just as a shameless plug. How much fun it is to be a PCD. So please get involved. Yeah, it's an excellent program. It really is the core of everything I do. A couple of texts I want to highlight here are, how do we have priorities in seed banking? Where do we begin? We tend to focus initially on globally rare plants, regionally rare plants, but especially endemic taxa. Taxa of plants that are only really found in the New England states or nearby, or the majority of their populations tend to occur in that region. So these tend to be our high priority for making sure we have seed banked of those taxa, making sure we are involved in management or introductions or restoration of habitats where these species thrive. And I want to give a little bit of a sense of how we go about collecting for the seed bank and how we get the seed of the rare species. I'm going to talk a little bit about genetics tonight, but I swear it won't be too sciencey. I do want to use this quote, though, that spatial variation as a proxy for genetic variation is how we started a lot of these collections initially. You have Lanctus nova angli on the screen here, northern blazing star, a plant that is near endemic to New England. And essentially just a mock-up of a map of an old map program we used to use to look at, well, are we getting the major compass outliers of this plant across its populations? If we can get the north, south, east, and west populations covered, and then the bank with representative wild material, then we should look at outliers, we should look at island populations, disjunct populations, where there's likely to be a genotype that we don't have banked in the seed bank. All of those genes sitting in that freezer are there for their adaptive potential to climate change, to major disaster, or otherwise to threats to the survival of those species. So it's really crucial we have enough genetic diversity in the bank to represent what would be in a wild population or across wild populations for a species in this region. And then just because I had a photo of a really cool alba floral white flower Lanctus nova angli from Nantucket last year, I threw it in here. I want to talk a little bit about priorities and how we do that. I'm in the middle right now of revising Flora Conservanda for 2024 with my colleague, Dr. Jessamine Finch. This is building off of work that William Brumbach did before me. 1996 and 2012, Flora Conservanda was published in Rhodora. I'm just going to have it out here. Essentially looking at the species that are globally rare, regionally rare, and then kind of unique cases. Taxa that are genetically disjunct from other populations of their species in the region, historic taxa needing more information, and the like. I put this slide here because that 62 became 63 in 2018, which for an area like New England, like Massachusetts, where you have a lot of folks that know their botany, know their plants, and are looking at the ground, finding a new plant, finding a plant that has been historic for a generation is just a wild thing to have happen. So that happened in 2018 with this species. Schwalbe americana, American chaff seed. This is a really neat plant that it's kind of a hotspot for in the world is the mid-Atlantic or on the pine barrens and a lot of sandy, fire-adapted habitats. And in 2018, this plant that hadn't been seen since 1965 was stumbled into in a really robust population on the Cape. And that changed a lot for how I view plants and plant discovery, so to speak. But also it made us really think about how we manage this one population of this extremely rare plant. Just a little bit about it, just as a preview, it is a plant that grows in sandy, acidic, usually disturbed, sandy habitat. It can grow inside of a highway, as well as in a pine barren, as well as in a semi-wet meadow. It's a globally imperiled plant, or G2. It's endangered in Massachusetts, where it was historic since 1965. It's been historic, not seen since 1965. It's on the federal endangered species list since 1992, and its habitat continues to decline because of fire suppression in general, and management of wildfire. So this is what a map looked like just before that discovery. Here we are in the historic range for Schwalbe americana. And then this happened, and we made the globe, and then folks got really excited. I had a friend that had a fender bender because he got the news while driving. Just the first line in this is really great. It says, state wildlife officials and local botanists are sprouting smiles after the holy grail of plants was discovered this summer. A jaw-dropping find that puts to rest a decades-long search in Massachusetts. I have a whole talk that's just about this plant because I also went into historical archives, I went into burial records, went into a lot of the historic records of populations in the state of Massachusetts. We got funding to search for it and did not find it despite a lot of effort. Here's a search image so you can go find it. This is it in fruit. This is a capsule that has a couple hundred seeds per fruit. They tend to be pretty small in scale to a penny here. You can see these winged achenes on the right. This is me and my staff going back to this one location after the discovery was confirmed by the state botanist and doing a full-on inventory to count every single plant, count the individual flowers on those plants, and record that data for our conservation purposes. So I want you to see the sense of scale for this population. Here's maybe 4 or 5 plants in the foreground, and photo credit for Uli Warmer, Director of Horticulture at NPT. Backing up, you see maybe 100 plants, maybe 1,000 plants. I hope you can see that kind of fuzz of pink that's occurring across this meadow. And even more. So I think we counted something like 4,300 individual stems, just tons of flowering, figuring each plant has 10 to 20 flowers. Each flower has a couple hundred seeds per capsule. Just a lot of seed. We collected for the seed bank about 18,000 seeds, using our strict NEPCOP protocols of no more than 10% per plant, no more than 10% per site. So even that 10% was close to 20,000 seeds. Now we used a habitat suitability model, which sounds fancier than it is. Essentially, it's just looking at attributes that plant has that are specific to it on the landscape, where it's likely to show up because of landscape attributes. That said, some taxa are much easier than others. I don't show this to complicate things, just to say that the primary metric, and the one, if you look at the top of this figure here on the right, you can see that primary metric, the first one, is weighted really strongly, and that's distance to sand. I don't know if you've been to Cape Cod, but there's a lot of sand on Cape Cod, and it can be really tough to use that as your primary metric, directing you as to where to go search some random place for this plant that hasn't been seen in any generation. So other ways of representing that, don't need to focus on it. But just to show you that there's also this kind of probability map for the coast, the Atlantic coastline for Schwalbe americana. And again, you can see some of those hot spots in the dark blue, the Cape, and a lot of areas in the mid-Atlantic. So we started this search by narrowing that down to areas that were just seemingly really high suitability, 90% or 95% or greater probability of finding Schwalbe americana in those locations. A lot of the Cape and Islands were searched for. I spent an entire summer with 4 staff looking for it, going to historic sites, and there's still only the one. So if you're inspired to do anything from this talk tonight, please find more Schwalbe americana. Please find more American chapseed, and let me know so that we can learn more about it. But we have that seed, we have the potential to not only augment its populations in the wild, but to learn more about that species ecology and to welcome it as part of the flora now. Now, I want to talk a little bit about using the seed bank more generally. That's one specific case. And a lot of my work has been on rare species. But not only do we do that work, we also do a lot of habitat restoration work. Anyway, these large bags of seed are not from rare plant seed collections. They're from Hurricane Sandy habitat restoration collections we made 2015 to 2017. The program I'll talk about in a little bit. But a couple more case studies that I think are really neat. And this one I shamelessly talk about every single time I give a talk. It's a plant I've seen every single individual plant every year for the last decade, and I take that to heart. This is Jessup's milkfish, Astragalus rubinzii variety, Jessipii. It's a Diabaceae, it's a pea that grows along kind of calcareous river outcrops on the Connecticut River. It grows in a pretty small area of the river, about 18 kilometers total, with 3 populations on Earth, and that's it. So every flower that this plant puts out, I look at and I document. We, year after year, take seed from the seed bank when it's a good year for that plant. We bring the seed out from the seed bank, we grow it up in a greenhouse, and we bring it back typically as plugs in this kind of awkward dance with transect tapes across the site and trying to not tiptoe into the river while avoiding plants you're stepping on. So while being a really beautiful pea, we put an awful lot of work into this taxon that we just couldn't do if we didn't have the seed bank and an understanding about genetic diversity. It's worth mentioning this plant, with its 3 populations globally, each one of those populations is isolated genetically. It's evolved to have seeds that sink in water, so they do not move down the Connecticut River. Never mind the fact that pollen does not transfer between these kind of disjunct locations. So each one of the 3 populations on Earth represents a genotype that you could not get back if you lost it. Therefore, representing that genotype in seed that's stored or otherwise is really crucial. It's also worth noting that, I talked about this one a little bit, that these outcrops that you're seeing on the image and a lot of these flowering plants, they thrive in ice scour habitat where in the wintertime, sheets of ice are scraping those rocks bare of competing vegetation. This year and last year and the year before, that ice scour got less and less. More leaf material is on site, more competing vegetation is on site. And last year, with a lot of flood events, plants were underwater for 3 days in a row. We had mortality effect where we went from thousands of plants to single digits of individuals left on Earth. I saw seed in the legume, in the pod, germinating. We saw vivipary for the first time in the history of this plant because of excessive moisture on site. When a seed germinates on a fruit, it's not likely to fall onto the ground into a spot where it can grow and thrive into a full plant. Nor can we collect it and bank it in a freezer or dry it down in a drying room because it's already germinated. So that's a major concern, and this is 60% of the fruiting individuals across the species worldwide that had germinated in fruit. We use the seed bank to understand other species and help them in their existence, essentially. So Universalatus winged monkey flower, endangered plant in Massachusetts. We got involved when there was a big management project where town was putting in some wellheads. We got called in to collect seed, take seed from the seed bank, as well as to just up and move plants to a new location where they'd be protected. So here's my poor job of sowing a bunch of tiny seeds in a very inconsistent way that became plugs. And just like the Jessup's milkvetch, its kind of affinity is these south-facing, low-energy mud flats. So it's always a fun place to be in the field working with these species. Here's what I encountered trying to get down one of the rivers in Western Mass where its populations are found. And what's not pictured here is my colleague behind me in a kayak, and then another kayak with a flat full of plants that I had grown from the plugs. So we got that down miles of river that was like this. So it can be a lot of work, but obviously that's exactly why I do this work. Likewise, not only did we take seed from the seed bank, we took full plants from where they would be destroyed. Nothing scientific about it, just bagged them up, put them in a truck, and moved them to a location where they could be protected. And I'm happy to say this is a budding Asami farm. These plants are still doing extremely well. But that said, a big part of the work we do is not just putting seed out there, but monitoring its health and how it's done after an augmentation happens or an introduction happens. So here's just an image of some of those plants that I put in from plugs. And maybe if you squint, you can really see the monkey flower face on the left, your right. But that's it right there, in flower and putting out a lot of capsules, healthily fruiting and seeding into the site that we put them. So it's lovely to see that kind of thing. Now I want to back off the rare plant stuff, which I tend to ramble about, and talk a little bit about the Seeds of Success work. This is kind of our first foray as an organization into habitat restoration, broadly speaking. Seeds of Success is a national program run by the Bureau of Land Management and more recently Fish and Wildlife Service that originally was really focused on rangeland restoration, wildfire restoration, and so primarily Western US focused. The real initiation of it in the East Coast was after Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy took place. We're trying to restore salt marshes, riparian areas, flood-prone habitats, things like that. And these projects were everything from dam removals and reseedings, or they were sediment deposition on salt marshes, invasive species removals, and things like that. We made a lot of collections of a lot of species. It's unique because of the lack of public land in the East. Less than 5% of the land is publicly owned in New England. So a lot of the work we were doing with this program to make these collections was cold calling land trusts, writing letters to get permissions and permits to make these large-scale collections for habitat restoration. So here's me and a group of interns looking at some Lathyrus japonicus on a dune, and likely collecting some of the seed from that taxon. Otherwise, training them in sedge ID and things like that. Here's a shot of Parker River National Wildlife Refuge, where we did a lot of work in remediating invasive species removal sites along the sand dunes, where they were kind of prone to erosion, so collecting a lot of beach grasses and things like that to stabilize sand dunes. And that's where this image comes from, with these pounds and pounds of seed that was collected and was leveraged for this kind of restoration. Just a quick image of what it looks like to have sediment deposition. So this is dredging of material from beyond the bay in Rhode Island, working with Fish and Wildlife Service partners to basically replant a salt marsh, up to 20 acres in this case. So we did all the seed collection of Spartina flora and a lot of the cord grasses that are common in salt marshes. That's what you see growing in the foreground there, protected generally from birds by this netting that's around all these plants. And then you can see after a couple of years, this is just 2 years later, a lot of rhizomatous recruitment, so plants spreading on their own, and gradually to last year, filling in this marsh to this degree, where it's just really remarkable to see. So, thank you to Wildlife Service for that, for sure. I got up my sickle when I collected some seeds, but beyond that, it's all them. But I will say, it's the kind of thing that we like to see, and that's exactly why we invest in that seed resource, because without it, this just wouldn't be this way. totally other end of elevation and habitat. We recently were working with National Park Service, Acadia National Park, on Cadillac Mountain specifically. Acadia and a lot of national parks across the country have been focusing on summit restoration, summits of mountains, summit revegetation in general with this project. So trying to make sure that places that are most frequently visited by humans, especially at Cadillac, where you have 500,000 to 1 million visitors annually, they can level a place to death. And we do really want to try to bring some level of functional ecology back to those habitats. This was an interesting one that started with us investigating a lot of the history of Cadillac, which had major fire in the 40s, had obviously a lot of human damage and trampling over the years. But understanding what the flora was from the summit of Cadillac down to the base of Cadillac. Then a couple of years of focusing on seed collection to represent those species that were from the mountain, or brought right back to the mountain. After going through this cycle. So myself, as well as my former boss, Bill Brumback, this is what our greenhouse looked like for a couple of seasons. Seed was brought back from a Cadillac, was grown in different types of measures. We were really trying to investigate what worked to get seed to stay on the summit that is really a mineral substrate. It's just kind of gravel for the most part. It's a coastal mountain, so it is ice scoured and wind blown and eroded quickly. So how do you get plants to live up there and to grow and then to gradually increase leaf litter and soil and thus biodiversity? So we tried first by seeding, direct seeding on site. It didn't work. We tried seeding and bringing in treated soil. Didn't really work. A lot of the seeds just died or desiccated out. We tried plugs. I'm just going to scroll through a couple of images of different trials in the greenhouse. We tried plugs of individual species that often you'd find a table of rock underneath where you put the plants, where water would accumulate, and then you'd have freezing and thawing, and it would kick the plants right out of where we planted them. So frost heaving essentially was happening. Then we tried these kind of modular flats, like I'm showing you up here, that had 3, 4, 5 different species in them. So it had a diversity of root systems, diversity of flowering times, diversity of form and function in general. And those worked a lot better than everything else. These images kind of look like some freakish burial ceremony or something, but this is just sandbags to hold down soil and hold down seeds with coir and netting, control plots and the like. But National Park Service allowed us to investigate this for several years. And then gradually we did start seeing these kind of micro sites within the summit that were having blueberry come back and Sabaldia and other plants that you'd find in the summit. So I'm zooming out now, and you can see this little sandbag area that was a huge success to me because it did gradually grow in. It did eventually populate with vegetation, and it looks really nice to this day. That said, it's a really small fraction of the work that has to happen up there. We were there to start this initial pilot of, well, can we do it from seeds? The mixed results from that. But what we learned is we need to back up in this kind of successional cycle. Plants aren't really enough in dropping their leaves and accumulating soil to allow seeds to blow in and to germinate from that organic matter. It's just not enough organic matter on site. So National Park Service this time around wants to back up and look at biocrusts, wants to look at bryophytes, lichens, mosses, and kind of back up in the trophic scale to see if that will do a better job of surviving this kind of harsh climate, ideally producing enough organic matter to have seeds that can drop and that can grow. So we got to back up in our successional cycle, essentially. And then here's just a great image of from a Bar Harbor from the top of Cadillac. Maybe it'll save us a couple of feet stomping on the summit at some point. But just a really lovely place to work and really interesting to our seed work. And then a great picture I just had of some of those seeds. This is Elaeocorus, a spike sedge, just really cool. I took this image several years ago. I want to move into talking a little bit about how seeds, plant diversity, and all of that stuff goes into the home garden, goes into public spaces, and the concept of ecological horticulture when it comes to that. I think a lot about conservation and plant ecology. I do have a background in horticulture, and it's really interesting to fuse those two together to see that humans don't always have to have a negative impact on the landscape. We typically think of ourselves as being just that vector, but in fact we can really work within a level of reciprocity with what is part of the ecology of where we live and how we interact with it. And a big part of that, I think, is understanding that whether it's my postage stamp backyard in Somerville or the wilderness area in the Pemmichewasset, each one can be ecologically viable. It does not matter if it is in the middle of an urban developed setting or in a wilderness area. Pollinators will visit and birds will visit, but a lot of that starts with the plants you pick for that location. and if they are native, if they can provide that kind of food. That said, I think there's been a lot of acceptance to this over the years. Several years ago at home, when I was living in Western Massachusetts, I had a visit by the local sheriff's department because someone had called the police because I had let my front lawn go to meadow, and I was growing it out that way, and they thought the house was abandoned. That said, I do think that has changed. I think that's becoming more accepted. I did have to put up a sign that said this is pollinator habitat, so that folks wouldn't call the police on me. But I think that's changing, and I'm excited to see that. Likewise, I think Beth mentioned it earlier, but native plants, when I started in this field, it was kind of a foreign concept to a lot of people that I was talking to, especially in horticulture. And gradually, I think that's become more commonplace to know about native species, know about native plants, and gradually, I think we'll get toward knowing about ecotypes, plants that are not just native to North America or to Massachusetts, but you can actually find their seed from this location, from this ecoregion we live in, so that you can keep those genetics close and their adaptive potential present on the landscape. So the time is now, I think, for that. And as a result, we've started a new initiative toward making seed available to everyone from nurseries to habitat restoration officials to anybody that wants it, because that supply just doesn't really exist. There's been a lot of interest, I think, because of these different areas of anxiety, interest in gardening, anxiety about climate change, loss of biodiversity, and a desire to make a positive impact on the landscape. Okay, an aside, a totally aside thought. I will say as well that when we think about what we're doing with biodiversity and plant diversity, it's only so much when we're talking about individual species. You can have one of every 20 species in a meadow, but that's not quite functional. It's not going to work. Even though you have the diversity of species, do you have the proportionality of species? And I know this word's kind of gross, bioproportionality, it's a lot of syllables, but I do think that's the kind of thing we have to also think about. We don't want to just preserve different types of things. We want to also have an abundance of them so that they can function in an ecology. So this meadow, for example, if we had one of each one of these taxa, it simply would not look like this. I want to plug a paper from 2021 by Dr. Freya Matthews called From Biodiversity-Based Conservation to an Ethic of Bioproportionality. I think it's a really neat concept and one I've taken to heart with the scale of all the work that we do. Speaking of scale, I should talk about public spaces. So a big thing we've been involved with over the years has been assisting with Department of Transportation projects, pollinator pathways, looking at municipal ordinances such as the one that just passed a couple years ago in Somerville, Massachusetts, that is specifically emphasizing the use of native plants in tree planting as well as gardening and otherwise. Looking at solar farms and the monoculture that they become underneath those panels, and while that energy is absolutely needed in that form, making sure they're not turned into ecologically unviable places to live. So a lot of these kind of spaces, we'd like to be able to address them by providing them a source of seed, not only native species, but of genetics in that seed that represent what's going on in New England with that taxon. I think we know a lot of these issues, major global threats to plants and insects and that relationship. That disruption of relationship is kind of core to a lot of why the seed is needed, I think. Whether it's wildfires, intense storms, drought, global warming, or the like, we're all familiar with this. I also want to bring this around to the pollinators because I guess what I'm talking about today is not just plants, it is everything else that lives off of them. 80% of flowering plants on Earth depend on insect-mediated pollination. Pollination leads to seed set, the key to future adaptations and species survival. If you want that genetic diversity, you got to produce the seed. Bees pollinate a third of the food grown in the U.S. Wild pollinators, twice as effective as honeybees at producing food and seed. And wild pollinators offering over $3 billion in pollination services in the U.S. if you choose to use that as your sense of value, which you can. Diversity is resilience. Not only are we talking about just an abundance of different species on the landscape, but the ability for them to adapt by their functional diversity, by their genetic diversity, to changing climates, to threats and impacts that we've just talked about. I get this question a lot about native plants. Native to where, native to when, is the question you should ask. And we are generally focused on the New England region. But that said, political boundaries don't make much sense to focus on if you're really looking at it from the plant's point of view. We tend to focus more on ecoregions, in other words, areas of kind of unique habitat, climate, geology, hydrology, that are distinct across the landscape where different plant communities thrive and others do not. So ecoregions, ecotypes, species collected from within those ecoregions, that's a big part of what we're trying to do with this network. Local ecotypes tend to be adapted to environmental conditions such as soil, drainage, climate. Otherwise, they have the ability to be flexible with changing climates and in the region they're growing. They maintain those existing evolutionary relationships with pollinators, with avian wildlife, with mammals, with you and me. Genetic diversity is kind of paramount to that ecotype existing. Ecotype or genotype, some might use synonymously, but they're not really. Genotype is a genetic makeup of a given species or location of a species. An ecotype is distinctly found within an ecoregion or something like that. More than anything else, it's most important that they are adaptable to climate change. And certainly more so than plants that are cloned or grown from cuttings that you might find in a typical nursery or garden center. So emphasizing seed again in that regard. And generally they require less resources. There's less of a need for the person to get on the mower, to spray herbicide, to fertilize, and things like that. Oops. Provenance is a big piece of the network we're trying to create. We want to have the standard that's kind of common of, I can ask where this seed came from, where this plug came from, where this plant came from, and you can give me an answer. As opposed to, it's from the same field, we collect seed from every year and have for 20 years. That concerns me because that seed likely is not all that genetically diverse if it's been across the same 100 members in a single plot for this long. So we do want to have something that can represent, essentially a wild population of the species, one that is genetically diverse, which means telling folks where you got it from and letting them decide whether they want to use it locally or more broadly. So this is essentially true in the art world as well as in the plant world, and I just wanted to highlight that. Again, this goes back to choreography of enology more than anything else. Plants co-evolve with a lot of organisms, whether it's the canopy above an herbaceous plant layer that maybe the oak trees are leafing out earlier than they used to, and that changes the window for that plant on the ground to get sunlight, to get pollinators to access it, and the like. Maybe the window for flowering or fruit set is changed, and now it's no longer in accordance or in choreography with the pollination of that plant, of the pollinators that would visit it, both generalists and specialists. Just a slide that came from Uli Lorimer that shows average growing degree days across the East Coast, from Orlando with its 12 months of growing degree days to Bangor, Maine with 5.2 months. I've heard a lot that in 2050, New England will have the climate of Virginia, but it's important to note it doesn't have to look like Virginia. It can still have the flora of New England present as we know it, and the adaptive potential still retained there. Just a simple example of where this cycle goes between pollinators and the rest of plant life, wildlife in general. We understand species richness can often be crucial for pollinator conservation. More pollinators increase plant pollination interactions, increase seed set, over to increased availability of plant-based food, shelter, nests, nesting material, both for the chipmunk as well as for the hawk, and back around. And this is the part of my talk where I just show you a bunch of images that Uli gave me because they're really inspiring and beautiful. So I want to back up and just show, both from the insect perspective as well as from the plant perspective, some of these interactions that are really crucial. I had a conversation a little bit earlier today about inspiration and why folks got into this field, and I think that's really important to not forget. There's just a level of beauty and awe that has to happen to maintain that conservation ethic. So, wasps, beetles, flies, I won't go too fast, birds, and you see lobelias, and you see honeysuckles, hummingbird, clearwing, and wild bergamot. I should add, these are all taken at Garden in the Woods, so shameless plug if you haven't visited, visit Garden in the Woods. There's a lot of cool stuff happening there. Wild bergamot and friends, a variety of pollinators on wild bergamot. Spring beauty, mining bee in the bottom right, spring beauty, claytonias all over the place. Clasping milkweed, purple milkweed, four-leaf milkweed. Milkweed tussock moth, dogbane beetles, monarch beetles. The incredible chrysalis of monarch butterflies, or caterpillars. Monarch butterfly and New England aster, relationship in the making. White turtlehead and its pollinators crawling into their floral mouths. Turtlehead, Baltimore checker spot, caterpillars, which become the beautiful Baltimore checker spot. Amazing evolutionary relationship between the northern crab spider, spotted horsemint, goldenrod crab spiders, and their adaptation to camouflage on some of those goldenrods. And while I'm talking about insects, I should bring up the honeybee dilemma, which I feel like this is probably an audience where I won't get tomatoes thrown at me, but many will be upset by this discussion. Honeybees are very much different than native pollinators. I don't need to say that here, I don't think. But they are social, they will form large colonies which are perennial, honeybees will, versus native bees, solitary nesters, which are effectively annual in a lot of ways, as they don't really overwinter except for the queen. Honeybees are fiercely territorial, they're generalists, they prefer lots of flowers in one area and will typically feed until a lot of nectar and pollen is depleted. They have a much larger foraging range than a lot of native bees might. They are active for the entire season versus some native species of bees, which are small and seasonally active. And they can cohabitate as long as sufficient forage allows. So as long as there are plants to feed on, they will be there. There was a paper from 2016, Cade and Tepedino, that I recommend checking out, looking at a 40-hive apiary residing in wildlands for 3 months, collects the pollen equivalent of 4 million wild bees. And I won't read these all, but just to say, conserving honeybees does not necessarily help wildlife. I love honeybees, I love honey, but I will say this is a part of understanding ecology, is understanding that these relationships exist, and we have to champion them. Plants for pollen specialists, however, co-evolve with specific plants to fulfill nutritional needs, both for the plant to the pollinator. Species diversity is crucially important in this regard. You need a variety of different forage and pollen types for a lot of these taxa. Local provenance will support local specialists, both in phenology and choreography, but also likely in other things we cannot monitor or haven't monitored yet, such as the quality of proteins and pollen and things like that. Majority are solitary nesting and have shorter active periods. Pollen specialists are more sensitive to climate change and a lack of preferred species, hence the specialist part. Here's a messy spaghetti map of the Atlantic flyway, just so that you can also see that this impacts avian wildlife as well. There's a recent study by Desiree Narango and Lerman et al. Showing that Carolina chickadees are preferred to nest in yards with native vegetation. The best performing natives for that are oak, quercus, prunus, ulmus, and acer. So oak, cherry, elm, and maple. Raising a brood of 5 chicks takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, so an awful lot of insect diversity and abundance is necessary. Yards with 70% natives support more birds, put simply. This is a 2023 paper. Residential yard management and landscape cover affect urban bird community diversity across the continental U.S. We also want to think about the human part of this. This is Uli's son, so this slide I borrowed from him. Provide nesting and floral resources for the entire growing season. This is the plant diversity we're talking about. When we embrace species diversity, we embrace functional diversity as well as ecosystem resilience. Diversity has its function, that is distinctly allowing for adaptive potential. Choosing seed-grown native plants, species of local provenance if possible. Healthy ecosystems foster healthy food and healthy humans. There's also some legislation that should be noted with regard to native plants and pollinator health. Several call out the role of native plants in urban ecologies and their part in rectifying broken urban ecological systems, as well as long-standing environmental injustice. Some of them specifically focus on climate change, representing critical efforts to create resilience in our ecoregions as we navigate through that. All these initiatives rely on the local availability of native plants and seeds, and we need more folks that know how to grow them to make them available. A lot of nurseries don't really want to grow pathrush, which is just a Juncus tenuis, because it probably doesn't have much commercial demand, but it is really a ubiquitous taxon in a lot of disturbed soils, so it makes sense to have some of that. Now I want to get around to, if you can get that seed, then you can make that change, then you can make that impact. So the big removal is the Northeast Seed Network. It's this project that Uli Lorimer and I have been working on for a couple of years now. Thanks to funding from Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service, we've tried to build a seed strategy for the Northeast that essentially emphasizes local native species and high genetic diversity, known provenance seed that can be available for nurseries, for habitat restoration, for the home gardener, and the like. So this comes with a lot of specific conditions. We're right now trying to work on establishing who is in the region for seed users and producers. Who needs the seed? Where can we get it? Where can we do these wild collections? How do we set up a seed increase plot? It's essentially a seed farming operation. We've taken a lot of inspiration from other seed networks across the country. Society for Ecological Restoration has created a lot of these networks, including the Southeast Seed Partnership and the Southwest Seed Partnership. We are trying to create that same kind of thing in the Northeast. What is tricky is having facilities for cleaning a lot of seed, folks that know how to store and germinate seed, how to grow it in a nursery, how to collect it. All that stuff needs to be built up to have that seed network functioning. So we're trying to do that. We're trying to establish the seed species that should be collected initially. We met for the last year with, I'm on a species selection committee with the Northeast Seed Network now that is looking at about 60 different native taxa that we focus on initially for wild collection of a relatively small amount, so using Seeds of Success protocols. We collect 20% from the wild population. We bring it back to seed cloning and then store a portion of that seed from that one location indefinitely. But we also take a portion of that seed and put it into a seed increase plot. So we're growing seed, making it more available without pillaging its wild populations. You can still share that, you can make that genetic diversity available, and essentially have a representative community of plants in a garden that looks a lot like what you'd find in a wild meadow. And I think that's huge. Over the next 3 years, our goal is to try to collect from those 60 different species, and between us and maybe 5 other organizations, have protocols for growing them out, for making that seed available, and then gradually distributing that seed where it's needed. I talked about Seeds of Success earlier, and Hurricane Sandy and all that stuff, and that was purely reactive. We had to go find seed. We took 2 or 3 years to get all that seed following this major catastrophe. If we could have a seed source that can be leveraged and is proactive to think about those kinds of things that are going to happen again, then we can make sure we can respond quickly. We can maintain biodiversity as a result of that. So having that seed bank on hand of common, abundant taxa is really crucial. We're trying to build that. We also want to educate folks with regard to ecotypes, source-identified seed, especially folks that are working in kind of the nursery industry where that is not necessarily the first thing you think of when you're trying to put together a nursery business. But we fortunately have a lot of folks that are part of that do have that perspective from the commercial end that I simply don't have. So that feedback and interest is really exciting. If you could go to Lowe's or Home Depot tomorrow and buy local genotype native species seed, where you knew where it was collected and how it was collected, I think that would go an awful long way to us understanding our relationship with nature and our role in ecology in our place. We also want to understand the demand of large-scale agencies. I talked a little bit about DOT, about Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, pollinator pathways, local conservation groups. Who's out there needing seed? And it really seems like everybody is. I field this question more often than any other. Where do I get seed of XYZ taxa? And I say, I don't really know. The next closest source is going to be one of 2 distributors out of the Midwest that probably have that species, but definitely don't have the genotype that's kind of local to where you're using it. So, I use this example a lot. Canada goldenrod in central Maine and Canada goldenrod in northern Florida, they're the same species, but they're very much adapted to different ecoregions. And so it just makes more sense to try to leverage that local genotype if you can. We also want to understand the private and public land managers' needs. Again, trying to make sure this is available to private individuals and citizens as well. I want my yard in the city to also have representation of high genetic diversity, native species that make sense and support pollinators. So this year is kind of, this plan's taken off. We're trying to get some of these seed collections done. Shameless plug, we're hiring. We have 5 positions we'll be hiring this season. Folks that will do kind of seasonal seed collection work. So working with me to learn a couple hundred taxa native species, and then to try to scout locations to find them. Looking at a lot of conservation lands, looking where there are really abundant populations of these taxa. That can support that kind of collection without doing harm to them in the wild. So a lot of that is scouting, identifying those populations, and optimizing timing, because again, you have to be in time with when that seed is available and not miss that window. So in addition to just having folks that work on this, we also tend to have a whole network that shares resources. We want this model to be one that is, it's based in New England, it's based in the Northeast, but it should be replicable elsewhere, just as the models we've learned from we don't want to, it's not proprietary, we want to share this with everybody that can make it happen, and cover as many ecoregions as we possibly can. As well as folks understanding how to farm with native species seeds, how to farm and maintain genetic diversity. There was just a paper that came out maybe a year ago that was looking at the effects of different cold periods on the genetic diversity of native species. So if you're in a nursery, a commercial nursery setting, you might be emphasizing shorter cold periods because you want to get your product out there. That actually impacts the long-term ability for that plant to withstand those longer cold periods and not die from it. So that can happen in a really short period of time. And that kind of thing really inspires me to make sure we think about how are we domesticating plants by taking them from these wild populations and putting them into seed increase operations, seed farms, essentially. And we want to make sure we're aware of that too. One more mess of a pathway or map, I guess. This is kind of how we do all of the seed collection work, whether it's for rare species or seed processing or seed production and the like, between our wild seed collection teams, bringing seed back for seed processing. I should say all the rare species seed cleaning is done by hand, as Beth took part in years ago. The work that we're doing with more common and abundant taxa will need to be done through agricultural crop scale seed cleaning. So we're building a pretty large facility at the Zombie Farm. We started last year. It'll be constructed this season. That essentially acts as a plant materials center. These are kind of generally federal agencies that can clean really large quantities of seed and make it available, do germination testing on it. We're building it at Masami this year. So we're hoping to really be a hub for a lot of this seed in the center of the region, but sharing it throughout the Northeast, and hopefully making that model available to other folks in different geographic regions. So we've been trying to get surveys out there, as everybody has, it seems like, to find out who's producing seed, who's farming seed, who's using it, what are they using it for, is it restoration, research, nursery use, private use, do they collect seed, how do they collect seed, where are they storing it, things like that, seed research. We have a variety of committees right now in this nascent network. I just proposed that we have a scientific research committee that does look at a lot of these best practices, because while we're trying to emphasize local genotypes, we don't necessarily know if this one species of goldenrod really needs to be focused on as a local genotype, or if it's got just a handful of genetic variation across its range. Very much possible. We want to know that. We want to move away from just best practices toward data-driven results and operations. So that's a big part of it, as well as having a species selection committee that thinks about which taxa we're collecting from, make sure they're not of conservation concern, and things like that. And I should say that every other part of it, nursery contingency, folks that do the farming of the seed, and everybody that's thinking about the protocols and guidelines we put out there for how to do this. So, this year is the second year we'll have seed plots at the Masami Farm. We have 12 species growing up there right now, which we chose based on kind of functional diversity, taxa that we got a lot of requests for from agencies that were using them for habitat restoration, and trying to run the gamut of different root types, different flowering windows, different pollinators that they're supporting, even across a dozen taxa, trying to maximize the diversity of seed we can offer and its functional diversity on the landscape. So I expect a lot of this to be more online through this year. We just created a website for this, the Northeast Seed Network, and please check it, because we're looking for folks to be part of this. If you need seed for anything you're doing, whether it's your home garden or a restoration project in town, a pollinator pathway, we want to make that seed available to you. We don't want you to have to go to the other side of the country to get the native species from New England to grow it in your garden. And then just to summarize, this is essentially what this whole cycle looks like. This is from EcoHealth Network, one of the close partners we've had in putting this Northeast Seed Network together. But no matter really where you start, this cycle is what this is all about. We start often with ecosystems undergoing restoration. We move into responding to that by getting seed collections done, banking seed, testing that seed and cleaning it, field establishment of that seed, growing it out in a farm plot or something like that. And I should add, it's also much more flexible than just growing crop rows like every other crop in the West. Smith Botanic Garden has been a partner in this from the beginning, and had a great way of interpreting seed increase plot. Essentially, they've got part of their garden that has some of these plants that will have seed harvested from them for this project, but there's interpretation, there's display, it's aesthetically pleasing. It's something that you can sell to folks that have no interest in this, and they don't really understand what this is all about, and I really like that. So I think this is, it's a new area where a lot of protocols can still be redefined, and I'm excited about that. We hope folks can learn more about how to grow these plants from seed to make them available as plugs, as modules, as full live plants, and then the cycle goes back around. We want you to monitor what's happening with those seeds and plants. We want to understand what the impact is, and then just be able to respond to ecological restoration demands, to home demands, nurseries, with high quality, known provenance, locally adapted seed of native species. There's a lot of adjectives in that, but each one is crucial, I think. And a big thanks to our partners. So it's not been just Native Plant Trust, Ecological Health Network, Janet Gardner-Smith College, Eco 59 based out of Connecticut, focused on that ecoregion, the High State Arboretum of Connecticut, Norcross Wildlife Foundation, and NOFA of CT. These are all places that have taken on some of the seed farming and assisted with seed collection. But this year marks the first real year we'll have dedicated seed collection teams, scouting and targeting sites for seed collection. I'm doing this with my colleague Uli Lorimer, Director of Horticulture at MPT. And if you have any questions or comments, thoughts about this, want to get involved, want some seed, please reach out. That's what I got for you. I appreciate your time.
I think we have some planted questions. But do we have some questions? Peter Barron?
Yeah, just one. Do you have a business opportunity with solar farms? Do you have a solution for solar farms? Because there's a huge market for that.
I don't have a solution. I'd be lying to you if I said I did. I will say though, I think. Thank you. I don't have a solution, but I do feel like a big part of being able to have a diversity of species, maybe that grow under lower light conditions or grow under solar panels. Again, a lot of that's going to start with having seed available, having plugs available to use that way. I'm happy if they get a native plant from the West Coast and plant it in a solar farm, frankly. I don't really care where it comes from, so long as it's not just a clover field or a monoculture of any kind. So that's the goal. I will say now, if you know anybody and want to put me in touch with them, please talk to me after the fact, but I don't have a solution. I will say that I think I would like to be able to make plants available of a high diversity of native species. Whether they want to use that and have a plan for it, that's a separate issue.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Oh, Holly. Hi. I'm just wondering, how quickly do seeds, do the genetics of seeds change? If you plant seeds in your garden, you don't know their ecotype or their provenance, how many generations does it take for them to exhibit characteristics that have adapted to that site?
So I'm going to try to summarize because I think we're probably not going to capture your voices on the recording, right? How quickly do seeds change? How many generations of them does it take to sort of show change?
It's a great question. There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer for that. Different species having different reproductive patterns, some being perennial, some being annual, will just have different amounts of genetic turnover essentially in every generation. I will say what we've used as a general protocol for seed increased farming, we typically will have three years of production of a given plant collected from a wild origin before we bring in wild material again to augment it. Simply to make sure that representative genetics of that wild population are there in the plot. Again, I think a lot of folks that do native plant seed increase now, they will have the same plot for 10, 20 years, and no augmentation of those seed increase plots with wild material or with genetically diverse material at all. So we don't really know. I think what's really interesting about the paper I mentioned earlier is that you're looking at violets, which not only have open pollinated fruits, but also have closed pollinated, self-pollinating fruits that are usually below ground. But you still see that shift in response to shorter vernalization periods in how they do in wild settings within a generation, within a single year. So I don't know, but I will say that that's exactly why scientific research is needed into all these issues. And I think a lot of folks from across the country that are involved in seed increase and seed genotypes are starting to do that research. But it will be slow as we look at individual taxa, individual reproductive strategies, annuals versus perennials versus biennials. That all makes a big difference into how quickly something responds on the landscape. So I'm sorry to have a second question where I don't have a good answer, but I don't for that one.
Yes, Beth.
So we see your PCBs collecting seed in the wild, and you've gotten us really excited about it. But you have a permissions process to go through, right? We shouldn't just go out and find wild seeds and say, oh.
All right, this is Beth Wilkinson, this question. So she's responding to the photographs of the excited plant conservation volunteers out there collecting and saying, but there has to be a permissions process, training and permissions from the people who own the land. You don't just say to everybody who came to this meeting, go collect seeds.
That's as much as I would love to. Beth, you know this very well as a PCB, but that, yes, we started a couple months ago getting permissions for the field season, which will starting now. But starting back in January, we are looking at who owns the land we need to access, how do we contact them, and how do we maintain permission for that. So hundreds and hundreds of landowners across the 6 states of New England. Myself, interns, and my staff, we're calling them on the phone to explain that we want to walk around in their backyard and look at plants. And that's a weird thing to do, to call about. And we do get hung up on, we deal with the time. I will say we also go through the permit process for everything we collect, everything we survey. So we're typically to the line on that because it is really crucial to the longevity of this program that we take that seriously. I should add that, you know, something like Seeds of Success that I mentioned during the talk, this national program, the reason I showed it as being unique is we use that same methodology in the rare plant world, in the PCB program, of cold calling landowners, of writing letters, of finding ways to contact for permits and permissions. We use the same strategy for Seeds of Success because Bureau of Land Management didn't give us a guideline on how to do that, because in the West, they were just on Bureau of Land Management land. They had a blanket permit. So we had to get up and figure out, well, here's a couple hundred landowners, we got to research, find them, contact them, and then get out there and collect the seed after all that. So it's a process, but it's a crucial one if we're going to maintain respect with landowners and that kind of relationship. I'd also add that I think this kind of program, the New England Plant Conservation Program, likely wouldn't have been as successful, especially starting in 1990, in other parts of the country that are not New England. New England does have a conservation ethic in a lot of ways, and I think folks generally understand, even back then, what we're trying to do. If we can get a couple minutes on the phone before they hang out.
Any more questions? Yes, Richard Freeman.
So I think one of the great threats to wildflowers in the New England region is probably deer populations. Is controlling deer populations part of the piece?
So let me summarize that question. One of the threats to wildflowers in New England is probably deer populations, and is controlling those deer part of this effort?
It's part of every habitat management effort I've been part of, and usually in the form of exposures for initially putting down plants, putting down a seed, or the like. But that said, the seed network is working kind of in a vacuum in that regard. We hope that folks will use that seed for a variety of purposes. They'll still have to contend with invasive species, with deer, browse, deer pressure, and everything else that comes with it. This is the third question I don't have a great response to. But I will say, more research is always the answer. But I think ultimately, we have to do more than just exclude deer from these plant populations. We do have to understand how they can be in some level of balance with the ecology of the places we live. And I think that takes a societal change in a lot of ways, as well as a lot of maybe government level initiatives. It's tougher to do on the piece by piece, individual land trusts or conservation commissions. So I don't have an answer, but I will say that generally, yeah, that's a big part of just managing the survival of anything we put in the landscape. If we have to exclude deer, we do that, but it's always of mixed results, for sure.
Take a couple more questions. We've got somebody in the very back there.
Thank you.
Emily.
This is a really great presentation. My question is, Governor Healy has announced first statewide biodiversity goals, and they're putting together the plan now. You should really be helping them figure that out, so I wonder if you've been in touch with them, or if they've been in touch with you for advice.
So I'm going to summarize. This is Emily Norton's question. The Governor Healy has announced a state biodiversity planning initiative, and she's wondering how NPT is involved in that, or if they're being consulted.
Short answer is no. I will say that we had some traction with a couple of different mayor's offices when the Conservative Plant Diversity in New England report came out, and got to talk with Ed Markey and a couple other folks that were interested in it. But it didn't go very far, and I'd certainly love to have a seat at that table, but it's not yet, we've not yet been invited to do that. Short answer.
One more question, Marcia.
So Green Newton distributes these packets of milkweed seeds from the organization Save Our Monarchs. And I tell people that the monarch butterflies are very fussy eaters. They don't only eat the milkweed plants. And so I'm just wondering, I ordered 500 packets every year and distribute them through. And I'm just wondering, is that a good thing?
Just ordered another 500 packets of milkweed seeds from Save Our Monarchs, is that the name of the group?
Yes.
And she's just wondering if that's a good thing.
Emphatically, yes, of course it is. I think one thing that this talk needs to be prefaced with, maybe I did not do that, is the perfect is the enemy of the good here. Again, I want us to have a supply of native, locally adapted seed available to you, to me, everybody else in this room. But that said, I'm not going to discount or throw away folks that just want to use native species seeds anywhere, anytime. I'm excited that that's happened. I get, I think back to my mom a lot of the time, who a couple of years ago reached out to me to tell me, hey, I've got a lilac in my yard. And so starting with the fact that you can see a plant, you can see something green, let's start there. Let's get excited about that. Then we'll talk about native species, and then later we'll talk about genotypes. But the first things foremost is make sure that there's something growing on the landscape, and that certainly that it supports those relationships with monarchs and otherwise. So no, you're doing great work, and I hope you keep doing it. I hope we can make seed available even more locally in the future for you.
Thank you, Michael. One thing that Michael said, and then I'm going to thank everybody for coming and remind you to take your centerpieces home again. And when he talked about we don't just have to protect nature from people, we have to think about people contributing to nature. It brought back the statement that Elizabeth Solomon of the Massachusetts told us in 2022 that NISA quoted in the land acknowledgement about being in a reciprocal relationship with nature, neither using it as a resource nor seeing it as something static to protect, but a relationship in which we give to nature as frequently and as much as we take from nature. So one of the things that's in my many decades of messing about with environmental issues that I'm glad to see is we no longer have this hierarchy of prestige in which people say, I'm protecting wilderness, I'm not just gardening. There's no just gardening anymore, and I think that's a really good thing. So again, reminding you to take home your centerpieces, please, and I'm guessing Michael, wherever
What
he
species is
snuck off to.
What kind of environment is it like?
The
flowers.
With violets and fennel. Right, Catherine? Where's Catherine? Violets and fennel. And feel free to ask many of our expert gardeners in the audience what kind of soil they like, because I'm not one of them. I'm guessing Michael's willing to hang around a bit and be pestered with some more questions once we're done, but I want to thank you all very much again for coming.